He laughed, and the room laughed with him, because laughter is cheap when you believe the numbers are on your side. 50,000 planes a year, the Americans promised. It sounded like a dare from a nation that still measured its air power in dozens and training flights. Hermann Göring, who loved a stage almost as much as he loved a uniform, mocked the figure as theater. The Reich could do theater too. Parades, banners, flypasts over cities that would learn the difference between spectacle and endurance. But the joke soured. By the time the war bent toward its hardest years, the punchline had moved across an ocean and set itself to a metronome. In Michigan, a factory called Willow Run began breathing like a machine that had learned a hymn. A B-24 Liberator rolling off the line roughly every 63 minutes. On some shifts, the cadence sped up or slowed, but the rhythm never forgot the song. The Luftwaffe, which had learned to treat calendar pages like friends, discovered that the calendar had turned traitor. The crazy production order began as a speech and then became a nation's homework. In May 1940, when the world still thought words might hold back steel, the American president said out loud what industrialists had been whispering behind closed doors. The United States would build airplanes in quantities that made military men blink and accountants reach for larger pencils. Skeptics pointed to the ledger. The United States had built 3,611 military aircraft in 1940. A generous person could call that a warm-up. The new figure, 50,000 per year, was not a warm-up. It was a change in the scale of thinking. Either the country would change the way it made things, or it would discover what happens when enemies are better at math. The order sounded like a slogan in headlines and like a blueprint in boardrooms. Somewhere between, it became a schedule pinned above machines. The audacity had a clerk's face. William Knudsen, the General Motors executive who knew how to turn paper into throughput, left a $300,000 salary to work for $1 a year and the privilege of telling factories that they were now regiments. He could be blunt. He could also be musical when talking about flow. A car plant does not become an airplane plant by switching signage. It becomes one by learning to hum in a different key. Airframes hate variation. Engines hate sloppiness. Jigs, fixtures, gauges, these would be the new generals. Knudsen walked the floor at companies that had spent a lifetime polishing chrome and asked them to polish rivet lines instead. He pushed the habit of interchangeability down into the fingertips of people who had never cared whether a part fit any car but the one in front of them. He told managers that their calendars were now 6-day weeks, with a 7th day set aside not for rest, but for retooling. The idea of a production order ignores the argument that followed, and the argument matters. Management met labor at tables that had been bruised by years of strikes and speed-ups, and found new language because the old words had become too expensive. Unions demanded safety and predictability. Managers demanded output and secrecy. The government demanded all of it at once. The compromise was not pretty, but it was productive. Plants lengthened shifts and shortened excuses. Women walked through doors that had been guarded by custom, and men who had never taken orders from a woman found themselves trained by one. The pace picked up in a way that made stopwatch men feel like celebrities, and then like villains. And in the hangars, fuselages on dolly wheels began to look like sentences, subject, verb, object, rolling toward a period at the far end of the building where daylight waited with a crew chief and an inspection sheet. A number by itself never builds anything. The distance between 3,611 military aircraft in 1940 and 96,270 in 1944 was paved with committees and arguments, and with an invention as American as the assembly line, the standard form. The National Defense Advisory Commission taught factories how to talk to Washington without screaming. The Office of Production Management taught Washington how to listen without pretending it could run a drill press. The War Production Board turned a chaos of requisitions into a hierarchy of needs that could be understood at the pace of a conveyor. If you picture this as bland bureaucracy, you miss the heroism required to persuade 100 proud companies to share parts, to share tooling, to share secrets. The government sweetened the medicine with cost-plus contracts that told managers they would be reimbursed for materials and labor, and then given a margin for meeting schedules. It wasn't poetry. It was a bribe to discipline. Factories don't grow out of wishes. They grow out of money that arrives on time. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a Depression-era creature that had learned to be comfortable in the pockets of banks, took on a new appetite. It financed tooling, underwrote expansions, and made it possible for a regional supplier who had only ever sold to a single automaker to become part of a chain that reached to Seattle and San Diego. A plant that made stamping dies for fenders learned to make dies for wing ribs. The steel did not care what it became. The people did. They needed cash flow and predictability. They got both in exchange for calendars that no longer cared about the seasons. Aluminum became the new harvest. Magnesium, rubber, spruce, copper, glass. The supply web fattened until it looked less like a chain and more like a nervous system. Blueprints became negotiations. An airframe engineer could imagine a curve that a toolmaker could not yet cut. A toolmaker could measure a tolerance that a purchasing agent could not yet buy. A riveter could hear a bad hole the way a violinist hears a wrong note and send a section back without asking permission. That feedback loop, which in peacetime would have been called friction, acquired a more flattering name: quality control. The Army Air Forces did inspections, and then they did more inspections, and then they learned to inspect the inspectors with statistical methods that made some foremen learn to love charts. It wasn't that the country discovered science between 1940 and 1944. It discovered how to force science to keep a schedule. Standardization did not mean uniformity. Boeing, Douglas, North American Aviation, consolidated. Each had a culture and a shop religion. The trick was to make their differences rhyme. A rivet pattern could be a dialect as long as the parts spoke the same language when they met at the depot. Interchangeability became a catechism. The technical notes read like scripture for the devout and like threats for the lazy. A sub-assembly arrived late. The line redesigned itself around the missing piece, and then captured that redesign on paper so nobody had to improvise twice. Even the improvisation had rules. That is what separates a miracle from a habit. The miracle is a story. The habit is a form. Detroit had never been shy. It had built itself on the boast that anything could be learned if the learning paid. When the order came to switch from cars to aircraft, the boast was tested by geometry. An airplane is not a car with wings. It is a set of tolerances that take offense at casual habits. The first time an auto plant tried to roll an airframe down a line, the line's habits rebelled. The dolly wheels stuck in grates not designed for that weight. cables snagged on corners that had been decorative at automotive speeds. The airframe flexed where a car body would have shrugged. Managers sweated behind clipboards while inspectors savored the new leverage that comes with being right. The lesson arrived in shavings and bruised knuckles. You do not assemble a bomber, you stage one, you fixture one, you jig one, and only then do you let it move. Willow Run was the country's public experiment in mass aviation. Ford knew how to build a machine that built machines. The feat at Willow Run was not a single hero, not a single machine. It was choreography. The B-24 was a complex, cranky creature with a reputation for punishing sloppiness. Ford broke it into sub-assemblies that could be built like nouns and then stitched together like a sentence. Wings here, fuselage sections there, tails in a hall that smelled like a pencil factory. Spruce, varnish, glue, sweat. And then the great marriage where sections met on fixtures that pretended they were a single piece long before they were. The moving line advanced at a rate that made grown men do arithmetic under stress and made stopwatch men into minor gods. When it worked, a bomber emerged into the light roughly every 63 minutes. The time was a symbol. The substance was the certainty behind it. The modular trick taught other factories their own dances. Boeing could push B-17s through final assembly like a cow being born, messy, miraculous, inevitable, because the sub-assemblies arrived as promises already kept. Douglas perfected the art of the wing that could be bolted on like a sentence completed without a comma. North American built fighters in sections that allowed a fuselage to roll under a sealing tube that fed wiring in color-coded veins. The painting booths learned to stop treating camouflage as fashion and start treating it as throughput. A line stopped being a line and became an argument with friction, settled by men and women who had learned to make their hands loyal to gauges instead of to stories about how things used to be done. The country also learned how to move failure upstream. A defect found at final assembly was a defect that stole days. A defect found in a jig stole hours. A defect found in a drawing stole only a meeting. Checkpoints multiplied, but they were not walls, they were nets. The difference mattered. A wall stops everything. A net catches what you do not want without slowing what you do. The auditors who had once been feared became coaches because they could tell a plant manager how to regain 50 aircraft a month by adjusting a brace that had never been designed for speed. That is what the order demanded. Not perfection, but momentum. You could build a perfect factory and starve it by breakfast if the suppliers failed. The air war demanded a diet that would have burst any pre-war pantry. Aluminum ingots traveled like soldiers. Magnesium needed chaperones. Rubber moved with guards and prayer. Copper became a currency. Glass traveled in crates with napkins between panes because a scratch at the wrong place became a lens that would turn a cockpit into a magnifying glass aimed at the pilot's eyes. Engines had their own kingdoms. Pratt & Whitney and Wright Aeronautical learned to talk to each other through the Army's impatience. Packard built the Rolls-Royce Merlin under license and discovered that a British engine can learn American punctuality without losing British manners. Propellers spun out of shops that had once obsessed over decorative chrome and now obsessed over pitch and harmonic vibration. Radios multiplied until a cockpit looked like a conversation. Bendix and Collins, and a pipeline of smaller firms delivered boxes that allowed aircraft to hear and be heard, and ground stations to direct so many machines that the sky became a map with moving ink. A bomber could be spoken to across a continent. A fighter could be warned away from weather that would kill it politely. The complaints that AM pilots had used as case studies in patience were not erased by FM alone. They were erased by the decision to treat the air as a network that required maintenance. Radios failed less because spares existed where spares had never been imagined, and because crews were trained to treat the set as a living part, not as the sulking box in the corner that someone with rank would fix when he felt generous. Logistics turned into a public utility with proprietary speed. Railroads scheduled trains as if trains were capillaries. Trucks learned to carry wings like mattresses, awkward, precious, strapped down with a seriousness that made drivers who had once hauled fruit feel like priests. Ports became mouths that never closed. The movement of crates learned to ignore weather, or rather to fear weather and move anyway. The dullness of this work saved lives with a quiet that historians often ignore. An aircraft factory without aluminum is a choir without air. A day lost at a smelter in the Pacific Northwest could echo 2 weeks later in a hangar in California, and 6 months later in a sky over Germany. The system treated those echoes as alarms. Fix the smelter. You save a crew you will never meet. Numbers alone miss the bravest change. The workforce acquired new faces and new rules. Women who had been told for years that factories were no place for them learned that war revised job descriptions. In the aircraft industry alone, hundreds of thousands of women, on the order of 310,000, moved into roles that had once been guarded like family heirlooms: riveter, welder, inspector, toolmaker, scheduler. They did not walk into paradise. They walked into shops with safety briefings that had been written for other hands, foremen who had learned to measure loyalty by gender, and restrooms that had to be invented because nobody had built them for this kind of day. They learned quickly because the machines punished slowness without compassion and rewarded competence with the only praise that mattered. The line moved. Black Americans who had been confined to the ugliest jobs or kept out entirely found doors opened by necessity and principles, sometimes in that order, sometimes reversed. The Fair Employment Practice Committee was called many names, not all polite, but its notices on bulletin boards and its inspectors in offices made it harder for factories to pretend that a war for democracy could be won with segregated time cards. Training programs multiplied until the very word trainee lost its sting and became a badge. A man who had been a porter on Monday became an inspector by Friday, if he could read a gauge and keep his temper. A woman who had never held a torque wrench learned to listen to threads the way a piano tuner listens to strings. Unions understood that this was their test, too. They pushed for safety rails and shorter shifts where exhaustion made accidents inevitable. They pushed against discrimination when it made the line slower and against favoritism when it made the line unjust. They did not always get what they wanted. Wildcat strikes erupted. Old grievances found new pretexts. Managers learned that command and control is harder in a room where half the workers are new to both the job and the politics of the job. But even in conflict, the rule held. Output must not fail. Daycare centers appeared in places that had never imagined them. Because the only thing more expensive than a trained riveter at home was a trained riveter gone for good. Cafeterias changed menus because the new workforce needed food that let them stand under weight for 8 hours and then ride a bus home with enough energy left to be human. There is a temptation to reduce this to posters, smiling women with bandanas, men with goggles making noble faces. The reality was much louder and more ordinary. A woman learned to set a rivet with her left hand because the right shoulder ached by noon. A man learned to read a micrometer with a prescription he could not afford in peacetime because the plant nurse knew how to work a small miracle with a form. A foreman learned to start safety meetings 5 minutes earlier because the bus schedule had changed and people were dozing in their chairs. Beneath the numbers you can hear the rasp of files, the pop of rivets, the huff of compressors, the slap of line boots on concrete, and the voices learning to sound like a team. Factories improve the way musicians do. Repetition, critique, repetition. Early engines came off the line with personalities, which is a polite way to say that some of them had moods no pilot should have to diagnose at 10,000 feet. Pratt and Whitney and Wright engineers camped on factory floors, like doctors making house calls, teaching toolmakers why 1/1000th of an inch matters in the way a crankshaft carries its own ambitions. Packard's license-built Merlin, an American accent on a British masterpiece, taught the country that flattery is useful when it arrives as reliability. The first time a P-51D carried that engine across a long escort curve and brought its pilot home with fuel to spare. The argument about whether copying is cheating ended in laughter. It is not copying if you improve the schedule and preserve the soul. Propellers have the vanity of ballerinas and the appetite of wrestlers. Hamilton Standard and Curtiss Wright learned to balance blades like judges balancing budgets. A nick at the tip is a story of a runway rock. A vibration at speed is a story of a factory's mistake. Balancing rigs became temples. Inspectors became priests. Wingskins learned to lap without wave. Control cables learned to slide without remembering the hands that braided them. Cockpits learned to grow in intelligence the way a person does, repeatedly and unevenly. Before 1942, a panel was an argument. By 1944, it was a language a pilot could speak even when fright rearranged his verbs. Quality control stopped being a scold and became an ally when it proved that serial defects were not sabotage, but a pattern in a machine. Statistical process control turned foremen into gamblers who preferred better odds. If a tool drifted, the chart told you before the pilot did. If a rivet hole wandered, the template shouted. Engineers learned the arithmetic of boredom. How many samples you need to pull, how many hours you need to watch, how many points you need to plot before you can say with a straight face that a wing will not fold before schedule. Boredom is not the enemy of victory. It is one of its parents. Failures still came, and they came in angry clusters. A batch of bolts with heat treat issues. A run of cylinder heads that cracked under load because the alloy recipe was spiteful. A fuse that popped under a voltage spike in cold weather because a designer in a warm office had ignored December. The learning curve was littered with apologies captured in memos and with fixes captured in production changes. The miracle is not that mistakes happened. The miracle is that they happened less every month. The graph lines smoothed just as the output lines rose, which is when factories begin to feel like orchestras. A first-chair machinist can hear a dull cutter the way a conductor hears a horn, a beat too slow. A shop that has heard itself improve does not want to go back to missing notes. Production is a boring story until it reaches the front. Then it becomes the difference between a sky owned by one flag and a sky negotiated at the speed of bullets. In early 1943, Allied air arms still felt outnumbered in the places that mattered. By early 1944, the math had flipped. Big Week in February marked the moment when production became a tactic. Coordinated attacks against the Luftwaffe's factories and airfields synchronized with escort fighters that could finally stay with the bombers all the way in and all the way out. Numbers refused to be subtle. When you can replace aircraft faster than the enemy can replace pilots, strategy begins to look like a ledger with a will of its own. D-Day required an air above an armada that would not be contested beyond harassment. That meant fighters on call like ambulances, bombers ready to turn roads into debates, transports moving paratroopers and supplies with a confidence that had once looked like pride. The Luftwaffe flew and fought. It killed and died. It also depleted. German jet technology entered the sky like a rumor with fangs, startling, fast, compelling in footage. But the rumor needed fuel, maintenance, and pilots with hours logged in machines that punished mistakes, with fires that wrote themselves across fields. The jets scared, and then they starved. Allied fighters learned to catch them on takeoff or landing, to make the sky small while the jets needed it big. It's not that technology did not matter. It mattered less than the schedule. Attrition is a demeaning word until it saves a life. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline withered under the constant pressure of losses and the bombing of fuel plants that turned flight hour into a rationed luxury. Experienced instructors rotated to the front to patch holes in squadrons, and the holes followed them back as bodies. Meanwhile, American training fields in Texas, Florida, Arizona, sun-swept production lines in their own right, poured pilots into cockpits with hours that could be trusted. Engines were swapped in hours, not days. Bullet holes were patched by crews who had learned to measure success by turn time, not by heroics. A bomber that limped in on 3 engines could be back over the continent before the pilot's nerves stopped ringing. The sky became an assembly line, too, built of schedules and the refusal to let fatigue set policy. To say that Germany failed because it mocked a number would be lazy. It failed because it built a system that mistook fear for discipline and terror for efficiency. Albert Speer rationalized and reorganized, and in places the curves bent upward. Dispersal of factories saved machines from bombs and killed machines with distance. Forced labor produced parts and murdered quality. Management by shouting produced speed in photographs and bottlenecks in warehouses. A Tiger tank required a supply chain built like a cathedral. Cathedrals are not good at emergency exits. The jet program bled resources into glory and produced aircraft that could not be kept in the air because the fields lacked trained hands, the depots lacked spares, and the pipeline lacked kerosene that had not been turned into a fireball at a refinery 2 weeks earlier. German engineers were not the problem. They were brilliant. Their culture of craftsmanship produced marvels. The problem was scale. A machine that takes 300,000 man-hours to build is a monument. A machine that takes 30,000 and can be shipped in crates that fit on a schedule is a weapon of policy. The Luftwaffe never solved the problem of turning miracles into habits. It solved it briefly in 1940, when the geography favored short hops and well-schooled crews. It did not solve it when the geography stretched and the crews thinned. The mockery of the American number felt true to men who had been taught by success to trust their instincts over spreadsheets. The war taught them too late that a spreadsheet can kill you when it belongs to a nation that knows how to turn cells into shifts and shifts into numbers that arrive even when the weather is foul. By 1944, when American factories rolled 96,270 military aircraft out of doors, from trainers to transports, from fighters to bombers, the German system was producing technology with adjectives, and the Americans were producing nouns. The difference is brutal in war. An adjective might be advanced, armored, long-range, jet-powered. A noun is enough. Enough bombers to hit twice. Enough fighters to fly top cover and replace losses without pause. Enough transports to feed armies that had learned to move faster than roads. Enough training aircraft to turn teenagers into lieutenants with competence. Enough to make courage a requirement, but not a plan. By the time 1944 turned its calendar, the numbers read like a drumline. 1 month, the country produced more military aircraft than it had in entire years before the war. Factories posted charts in cafeterias not to boast, but to pace breathing. This week's output, this month's cadence, this quarter's risk. A B-17's wing arrived on a flat car that had carried a different wing last Tuesday and would carry another tomorrow. A Douglas line manager learned to read a day's health by the sound of air tools at 9:17 a.m. If the pitch dropped, something was late. If the pitch rose, a fix had cleared. North American aviation's fighters multiplied like a rumor that everyone wanted to be true. The line workers took photographs when a round number rolled out, 10,000th, 20,000th, not because the planes were prettier than yesterday's, but because the arithmetic had become a kind of patriotism. The cadence at Willow Run kept its myth and earned its skepticism. No line is a perfect metronome. The 63-minute figure was an average across days when tools broke and days when everything clicked. What mattered was not that a liberator could be birthed from steel and sweat in roughly the length of a lunch break, but that the certainty of that birth let planners write schedules abroad as if America were a clock that cared. Schedulers wrote train timetables and convoy manifests and flight plans with a new confidence. The airframe will exist when we say it will exist. That confidence is the secret oxygen of war. The total arc would reach 295,959 aircraft by the end, a number so large that it loses meaning until you remember that every serial number was a machine with a history attached to it. Who riveted its skin, who set its last control cable tension, who signed the inspection sheet, who ferried it across a continent with a map folded into a pocket. That total did not merely bury the Luftwaffe under aluminum. It buried doubt under evidence. Göring, who had laughed at the order as theater, would later admit that the show had outlasted his actors. He called American production a fear realized. The fear had a simple shape: a people who could argue in public and still make their hands behave in unison when a schedule required it. William Knudsen's $1-a-year paycheck became a symbol because symbols are efficient. It told managers that this was not a time for bonuses disguised as strategy. It told workers that the men in suits had skin in the game, even if the suits stayed cleaner. More importantly, it told the country that organization is a character trait. The United States did not win because its machines were always better. It won because its machines arrived on time in numbers that frightened planners. Boeing's fortresses, Douglas's transports, North American's fighters, names that sound like product lines in peacetime, became synonyms for punctuality in war. The arsenal of democracy was not a metaphor. It was a set of shifts printed on paper and taped above time clocks. The legacy reaches forward like a runway. Postwar doctrine turned the production lesson into policy. In total war, lines are as important as lines of battle. In later conflicts, planners would ask first not, "What can this machine do?" but, "How many can we have? How fast? For how long?" The answer disciplines strategy. It forbids fantasies. It makes commanders write plans that respect factories. It makes factories listen to men who know how long a bridge takes to capture and how fast a battalion consumes fuel when the weather lies. Production did not replace heroism. It made heroism less likely to be demanded in stupid quantities. Democracy is messy. It argues with itself. In 1940, that mess looked like weakness to men who preferred armbands to ballots. By 1944, the mess had learned to count. It counted rivets, hours, trains, gallons, shift changes, accidents prevented by a guardrail that cost $20 and saved a week of output. It counted grievances and solved them with meetings that produced schedules instead of slogans. It counted women's wages and adjusted them when the math embarrassed foremen who had thought themselves immune to embarrassment. It counted, above all, aircraft, because each number became a pilot's confidence, a navigator's map, a crew chief's pride, and an enemy's problem. If you need the moral on a single line to take away and keep in a pocket, keep this. The crazy order only worked because millions of ordinary acts made it ordinary. A president set a target. An executive gave up a fortune to coordinate. A foreman learned to apologize to a woman he had underestimated. A riveter learned to switch hands. A machinist learned that a gauge, not a guess, is the difference between an engine that hums and one that sulks. A scheduler learned that a factory is a promise factory as much as it is a machine factory. And a pilot learned, looking down over a continent of assembly roofs, that someone he would never meet had given him a margin for error he might never need, but could not live without. The laughter at the beginning was not a sin. It was a symptom of a system that had confused pride with planning. The answer to that laughter was not a shout. It was a rhythm. One bomber every hour or so, one fighter every few dozen minutes, one transport that made it possible for armies to move like water, one training aircraft for every set of hands that would hold a stick. Production lines matter as much as front lines because, when they are built with discipline and defended with calendars, they can erase an enemy's strategy by replacing it with arithmetic. That is how the United States flooded the sky with machines and drained the war of the Luftwaffe's confidence, not with a single better gadget, but with an argument converted into noise that never stopped sounding like work. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, It looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late. The lesson, reduced to its mechanics, is that speed loves structure. Schedules are not cages, they are runways. A plant that knows exactly what arrives at 10:15 can recover from a surprise at 10:07. A workforce that trusts the clock can stretch without snapping. A supply web that has rehearsed its detours can absorb a train lost to weather without turning the next week into an alibi. These are not romantic achievements. They are the daily practice of a country that chooses to make coordination a virtue. In 1940, the choice looked like boasting. By 1944, it looked like a stack of airframes waiting in the sun, each with a serial number fresh in paint and a logbook already hungry for fuel. That sight rewrote the enemy's expectations and the future's doctrine. It proved that in a contest between mockery and manufacturing, only one side can afford to be late.